¿Me avisan cuando estemos en línea?
I can confirm that it's live streaming and it is recording. So please commence, Eloy.
Buenos días. Sí, ok. Gracias. Buenos días a todos. Bienvenidos a este webinar Más vale que prevenir que curar. Hoy, bueno, tenemos 1 hora y media por delante, muy interesante. Contamos con la participación de Patrick Rapo y bueno, en un rato lo voy a presentar, y también de Susana Silva como comentarista. Pero antes de presentarlos, le voy a dar la palabra a Eloy Muniel, por favor. Munibe.
Sí, gracias Alonso, muchas gracias. Bien, estimadas y estimados todos, reciban un cordial saludo y bienvenida de la Presidencia del Consejo de Ministros, en especial de la Secretaría de Integridad Pública. El día de hoy estamos iniciando la Semana de Integridad, una fecha muy importante porque se conmemora el día 9 de diciembre, el Día Internacional contra la Corrupción, y en el marco justamente de este día, nosotros en el Perú realizamos una Semana de Integridad del 6 al 10 de diciembre. La corrupción es un fenómeno complejo que se constituye aún y de modo transversal en uno de los principales problemas públicos en nuestro país. Una situación indeseable, pero también una expresión crítica de nuestro carácter como sociedad, que se aleja de la ética y la priorización del bien común al privilegiar intereses particulares y la obtención de ventajas indebidas en desmedro de los derechos y la buena marcha de la administración pública. ¿Podemos acabar con la corrupción? Sería tal vez la pregunta clave. La respuesta inmediata es sí. Sin embargo, para que ello se propicie, debemos continuar los esfuerzos que desde el propio Estado se han empezado a desarrollar de manera articulada en atención a recomendaciones internacionales y a buenas prácticas que venimos desarrollando con participación del sector privado, la sociedad civil y las entidades especializadas en la administración pública. Por tanto, nuestra estrategia debe ser integral, de pleno compromiso, no solo a nivel institucional, sino también individual, donde cada servidor público evalúe de manera permanente su desempeño ético al ejercer la función pública, incorporando el enfoque de integridad para prevenir y enfrentar el grave flagelo de la corrupción, así como también un sector privado y una sociedad civil participativa y que esté siempre pendiente del control social y de actividades de veedurías para que podamos potenciar el trabajo en la administración pública. Por tercer año consecutivo, estamos organizando justamente esta Semana de Integridad, y durante esta semana tendremos 7 actividades con participación de diversas instituciones nacionales e internacionales. La sesión de hoy ofrece una visión general de las lecciones aprendidas de la experiencia del Reino Unido en la aplicación de la responsabilidad jurídica de las empresas, e identificará también las mejores prácticas que se han priorizado a nivel mundial. En otros temas se abordará el marco de responsabilidad jurídica de las empresas, como habíamos señalado, la inteligencia e investigación, la obtención de pruebas de asistencia jurídica mutua. Bien, debo saludar el importante apoyo de GovRisk, el proyecto TAPI y a USAID, y también saludar especialmente a nuestro expositor internacional el día de hoy, Patrick Rapo, y también a Alonso Villarán, conductor del evento, que también estarán reunidos juntamente con Susana Silva Hasselman, panelista y experta nacional e internacional en temas de integridad. Dicho ello, tengo la confianza de que aprovecharemos al máximo este taller. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Eloy. Y a continuación paso a presentar a Patrick Rapo, nuestro invitado especial. Él es licenciado en Derecho por la Universidad de Oxford, experto en anticorrupción de GovRisk y copresidente del Grupo de Investigaciones y Cumplimiento Global de DLA Piper. Así que le doy la palabra y le agradezco por su participación.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come along and speak today. These are incredibly important events and on very important issues, so I hope that we can all sort of benefit from that. And before I start and sort of give my thanks to everybody for joining and for organizing this event, can I also say, please make use of the Q&A function to put in any questions that you may have throughout this session. And then obviously we have moderators here who will be able to ask me those questions at appropriate times when I do pause and take a short breath, as the interpreters have told me I need to speak 25% more slowly. So I'll have a quick pause for them to catch up. And what we will then be doing is going through probably about an hour's worth of discussion from me in relation to the international scene and what has been happening there in relation to prevention and other matters that help cure the issues around bribery and corruption. And we will at some stage have mute button pressed on me so that we can then ask a poll question of the audience that you will then have that question to answer. And then we'll continue for the rest of the hour and move into some sort of question and answer part of the discussion after that. So I'll pause for a second while interpreters catch up, and then ask that we move the slide forward to the slide deck that we should hopefully have in Spanish.
Just one moment, Patrick. Maria Faye, there's a couple of asking about the transition, if you explain. Okay. Sure. No problem. No problem. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you. Well, if we could just move on to the move the slides forward so that we just have those up on the screen. So this is the session that we're talking about today, which is prevention being better than cure. So what I thought would be useful to do is to look at the global position as to what international standards are and what other agreements are in place internationally that essentially provide the backdrop as to why the legal changes have been brought in, and also what the international standards are. And really the most important one in this list is probably the second one down, the OECD Convention, adopted in 1997 with 41 parties. To it, which essentially is the guiding document in relation to expectations as to bribery and corruption, and how countries should be legislating for this, how they should be taking action against foreign public officials who accept bribes, how they should be taking action against private companies that pay bribes, and then also how facilitation payments, for example, should also be made unlawful. But that's not the only guiding documents. There are others. The OAS Convention, which is an American convention which Peru has signed up to as well, and the European. I was a bit worried if I turned mine off, nobody would be able to hear anything. So thank you for clarifying. And the Council of Europe also has a European convention in relation to bribery and corruption, and also there's the UN Convention, which again Peru is a signatory to, which is adopted in 2004. So that's the international response and the international obligations which countries like Peru have signed up to. But ultimately, when you tie all of these together, there are a lot of similarities between them, and I like to call these the Magnificent Seven. So if we move on to the next slide, which shows the best practice sort of fundamentals as to what each country really needs to have as the backdrop to make these required legal changes. I think ultimately at the top of that slide, more money to enforce. Every country across the globe has got limited resources to enforce bribery and corruption or anti-bribery and corruption measures. But really the key to being able to have proper enforcement is to have sufficient funds to be able to enable that to happen. Next, on the right-hand side, I think there needs to be an education programs to educate the public to the dangers of financial crime, to the dangers of corruption, and why it needs to be enforced, because this is a societal problem. If it's happening within government, if government officials are accepting bribes, if that is happening in the judiciary, or it's happening with police forces or army and so on, it needs to become a societal issue that the country cares and doesn't want it to happen, and that's part of an education piece. So I do think there needs to be a raising of educational standards generally across countries to really try and stamp this out, both at a low level and also at a high level within government, because you need to tackle both ends of the spectrum to be able to really enforce anti-corruption measures. I think the bottom of that circle is action taken in the most serious cases, because obviously if there are significant companies, significant government ministers, or simply significant individuals within the country that are perceived to be getting away with corrupt activities, that sends an incredibly poor message, because it means irrespective of what the law is, irrespective of what the public education says, if it looks as if that's not actively being acted upon and action being taken against the relevant individuals, it becomes meaningless and people will effectively ignore it. And then I think ultimately on the left-hand side of that circle, I think you need to have individuals that investigate, that prosecute, and that decide these cases need to be knowledgeable. They need to have had adequate training in order to be able to do their jobs properly. So I think these are the four background, sort of north, south, east, and west of what needs to be there to be able to have an effective program, be that to cure corruption or be that to prevent it happening in the first place. This is really the fundamentals of what is needed there. So moving on to the next slide, once we've got those fundamentals in place or actions being taken in relation to them, actually, if we can move to the next one after that, I think it should be the best practice legal alterations slide. No, okay, maybe it's not there. Can we just go back 2 slides? Back 2 more? No, it doesn't appear to be there. Sorry, it may not have got into the system. But if we just leave it on this one here, in terms of legal alterations, sort of tying together where the legal changes will need to be brought in and have essentially been brought in within the UK, is really looking at number one, making active and passive bribery illegal. That's asking for bribes and then paying bribes. Both sides of that needs to be made illegal. Next is public and private sector bribery need to be made illegal. Next is that those who control others, who can make others change their behavior, such as a company being able to change the behavior of its employees, those who are in control need to be made liable if they fail to control people and those people pay bribes. So there's a real push in relation to corporate criminal liability to make companies and not just individuals liable. I think the fourth point is there needs to be significant penalties. So there needs to be real significant action being able to be taken against companies, against individuals, and significant terms of imprisonment, such as in the Petrobras case, something like 15 and 18 years imprisonment was handed out to government ministers in Brazil for their involvement in that scandal, accepting bribes. And then on the other side of the coin, the companies that were involved with that case ended up paying significant financial penalties. So as a result, not only were there significant financial penalties, there were significant jail terms handed out out. And those penalties and fines and imprisonment are very important in terms of the grand scheme that the OECD and other organizations are trying to get international backing and support for. The fifth one really is recovery of assets and providing compensation. You look at a lot of the UK cases recently, and compensation is being provided to the countries that have effectively wasted public funds in paying for corrupt programs, and the UK government has been effectively trying to return assets to the right places within those countries to ensure that they go back to good causes and go back to proper things that public money should be used for, as opposed to the corrupt schemes in question. And I think the last 2 points are probably the most important in terms of prevention, not cure. One is incentivizing whistleblowers to come forward and provide information, because you can't investigate every single crime in your country, because that is just prohibitively expensive. And unless one is running a communist state where one has informers absolutely everywhere, it's going to be virtually impossible to get that level of proper information coming through to then be able to enforce it. But if you have protections for and or incentives for whistleblowers to come forward, that is something which can really alert you at a much earlier stage that there is a corruption problem. And that can happen midway through a corrupt enterprise, or after it's been finished and somebody has audited the accounts and seen that the issues arise. So incentivizing whistleblowers is an important area to prevent corruption and also to help remediate it. And the final one is really incentivize, the seventh point is incentivizing compliance, cooperation, self-reporting and settlements by companies, because there will always be a company involved with paying a bribe to a government minister or paying a bribe to another company in order that they can make more profits themselves. And there will also be individuals involved. So what you need is everybody coming forward and effectively reporting to the government to say, we have uncovered a problem. And I think once that is done, you have a much greater and more accurate amount of information from which you can investigate and then effectively remediate the damage that has been done. So overall, these changes are things which, and thank you for putting the slide up, are changes which all countries are really bringing in. But I think if you want to make the most critical difference in terms of doing something that really will do something very big to break the spine of corrupt officialdom or corrupt companies, it's really points 6 and 7. They are critical to preventing corruption happening, getting that culture in place within companies and within society, but also importantly to have that remediation, that cure piece, because if you're able to get whistleblowers to come forward or companies to come forward, even if it's after a bribe has been paid, it means that you can investigate much quicker, much cheaper, and get to a resolution that is much fairer and helps everybody involved move on and take things forward. So, the topic of this session has been called Prevention is Better Than Cure, but this half in terms of incentivizing companies spans also the cure as well as the prevention aspect. So having said that, if we can move back to the sort of UK response to corruption slide, which I think is slide number 4. So the UK position here, thank you, is essentially divided across a number of different organizations. I won't go through this in any real detail. It's really there just for you to see how complex the position is within the UK and how there are a number of different organizations that are involved with investigating and prosecuting. But if we move on to the next slide, which is what these organizations are effectively working towards, is this one piece of actually very short and very good legislation. So the UK had a lot of very complex, very little used and very unfriendly pieces of legislation, which they wiped away and then set up the UK Bribery Act 2010, which really simplified matters. It's a very short statute, and if there's ever something that you wanted to use as a good lodestone of what a good bribery and corruption law looks like, I think the UK Bribery Act is in fact much better than the US FCPA, because I know that you'll be looking at other international standards, and the US are brilliant on enforcement, but the UK is actually very good in short, simple, clear legislation. And Section 1 is effectively paying a bribe. If you pay a bribe, that's the section which describes what you will be, what makes a bribe, which is effectively a financial advantage, which is done with an improper intention, and that is sufficient. So it's very clear, very short. And Section 2 is receiving a bribe, which again is the exact same. It's any financial advantage which you have effectively requested, and it's accepted with improper motive. So again, very simple, very straightforward. And then Section 6 is the bribery of a foreign public official, which is even more straightforward, which is effectively paying a financial advantage to a foreign public official, and that hasn't been approved under local written law. So again, with an improper motive, it's very clear, very simple language. And then Section 7, I think, is probably the most important one, which is the UK's attempt to bring in corporate criminal liability, which effectively penalises companies for failing to prevent bribery by an employee, by a subsidiary, or by an agent. Effectively an associated person, anybody who does anything for or on behalf of the company. And if those people or companies pay a bribe, and that results essentially in a gain being made by the company in question, the parent company in question, they will have failed to prevent that bribe. No matter where in the world it happens, as long as they undertake some activities or some part of their business within the UK, they will then be liable. And that's a game-changing piece of legislation, incredibly broad, applies to whichever country the bribe would be paid in, and effectively applies to any company, no matter how small their presence is in the UK. So in many ways, this is a much broader piece of legislation than the US Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, and has significant penalties, 10 years for individual, 10 years imprisonment for individuals, and an unlimited fine for companies. And as a result, this is very simple, very straightforward, and essentially the message that that sends to individuals and companies is that you will be in difficulties if you pay bribes. And that message, if we move on to the next slide, I've gone through there, again, some of the things that we've mentioned already about the companies and UK nationals that it applies to. And then if we move on to the next slide, this one here describes what I've just mentioned in terms of this being a game changer in corporate criminal liability, and how this route is effectively very much understood by companies, very much understood by individuals. In the Rolls-Royce case, a penalty was handed out of £500 million sterling to the company. In the Airbus case, penalties of 3.5 billion euros were handed out to Airbus, the company which had operations in France and operations in the UK. So those significant penalties are very important. And those laws, those tough, very wide laws, which are cure-based laws, but the fact of the matter is that without having them, they are the stick that beats the companies and the individuals. But on the other hand, we have a carrot, and that carrot, the incentive, is effectively if companies, if we move on the next slide, if companies have adequate procedures in place, they will have a defense to that Section 7 offense. And that defense effectively is based on 6 principles. The tone from the top, which is that middle blue circle on your screens. Risk assessment, as in you conduct risk assessments into areas of work that you're doing, individuals that you're going to be working with, so that you can assess what the risks of bribery and corruption are. Proportionate procedures to combat bribery and corruption. which are clear and accessible, obviously, to those that are reading it. Due diligence, again, which is proportionate due diligence based on the high level of risk if you're doing operations in Africa or in certain areas of Latin America, if you're working with local government officials, if you're doing freight forwarding, operating in ports, very, very much high risk areas like that, you carry out and conduct due diligence. Also, the next one, communications and training. So you communicate your anti-corruption policies to your staff, you train your staff, you train your agents, you train others. And the monitoring and review, the last of those 6 principles, is that you monitor and review your processes and procedures, you dip sample them to make sure that they're working, you amend them to make sure that they get better. And if you do all of those things, you are likely to be seen as having adequate procedures. And if you have adequate procedures in place, you have a defense to that very wide-ranging legislation in the UK. So this incentivizes companies to put into place adequate procedures and to make sure that bribes don't happen. And essentially, all of these adequate procedures are really aimed at 3 things. 1 is to prevent bribery and corruption happening in the first place. 2 is if you don't, and it happens, that you're able to detect it. So prevent, detect, and then the final one is remediate, that you clean up the mess afterwards. And those are essentially the 3 things that you want to incentivize companies to do. Is you want to incentivize them to prevent bribery and corruption, to monitor it, to stamp it out. You expect them to detect it. So if it happens within their company, you expect them at least once a year when they produce their audited accounts to have gone through their accounts to identify any bribes that have been paid. So you expect them to detect it. And then finally, you expect them to remediate, not only remediate the problem within their own company by getting rid of staff and the like, but most importantly, by coming in and reporting it to you. So this really, if it doesn't necessarily prevent bribery, what it will do is prevent it escalating so much. And then if they're able to come in to you as a country, as a government, as a prosecution agency, as an investigation agency, and pass over a nice little Christmas present of all of the allegations, all of the respected individuals nicely bundled up and handed over, you then have a much easier task to investigate, to prosecute, and to punish them. And again, you need to incentivize them to come in, because obviously if they were punished as much or more than if they hadn't come in, then obviously they're not going to come in. They're not going to self-report. So in the UK, they are incentivized effectively by having their punishments reduced if they end up coming in and self-reporting. So if we can just move on to the next slide.
Dear Patrick, maybe it's time for the question.
And here we're just talking about...
de repente es momento para la pregunta.
Oh, fantastic. Well, excellent.
Gracias.
Thank you for reminding me to slow down again. I keep on getting told off all the time. So I'll stop and then we can go to the poll question. Alonso, over to you.
Thank you. Gracias. Entonces van a ponerle una pregunta al frente y les pedimos a todos los participantes que nos ayuden a responderla. Ahí está. Deberían verla. En su opinión, ¿cuál es el mayor impedimento para la aplicación de normas anticorrupción en Perú? Escoja la más relevante para usted. Opción única. Primero, falta de recursos para la investigación fiscal y policial. Falta de capacitación técnica para la aplicación de herramientas procesales. Falta de incentivos para formular denuncias. Falta de incentivos para el desarrollo de compliance en el sector privado, cumplimiento en el sector privado. Entonces, les pedimos por favor que nos den su opinión con su experiencia, que es muy valiosa. Y cuando les parezca, veremos los resultados. De repente unos segundos, un minuto más para que todos, porque somos un montón de gente y nos alegra tanta participación. Podemos ver la respuesta de repente, aunque he perdido la pantallita. Está, ahí está. A ver, la respuesta con mayor votación, casi la mitad, es falta de capacitación técnica para la aplicación de herramientas procesales. Falta de capacitación técnica. En segundo lugar, falta de recursos para la investigación fiscal y policial. Bueno, y quizá la importancia de la tercera en lugar de votación, que es falta de incentivos para formular denuncias, porque quizás si hubiesen incentivos para formular denuncias, no habría tanta necesidad de investigación, ¿no? Y falta de incentivos para el desarrollo de compliance en el sector privado. Entonces, estas son las respuestas, y con esas respuestas continuamos con la presentación de Patrick Rapo. Muchas gracias. You can continue, Patrick. Your microphone is off.
Double pressing of my my mute button there to switch it on and then off again in immediate succession. So apologies for the technical glitch. It is a very interesting set of responses there, and obviously a lot of the rest of this session we're going to be talking about tools that can incentivize compliance, and that can also incentivize companies to come in and report matters. So although they scored at the lower end of the scale, we will obviously be giving you some technical training, so hopefully that will help those of you in the 48% category. And then in terms of resources, going from government, well, unfortunately, we can't assist you on that, but that's something I think which you will politically need to raise internally within the country for those of you within that 30% bracket. So if we can move now just to a couple of things which I think are actually quite interesting ways of bringing more matters to the attention of government. And if we can move forward to the next slide. Because I think the position in relation to whistleblowers is incredibly important, because it really does one big thing, which is if you significantly incentivize whistleblowers to come forward, to go direct to government and blow the whistle on bribery and corruption that they see, those that are committing the bribery and corruption will never know about it. But if they know that there is a tool available, if they know that it is being used, if they know that it is being publicized and people are really using it much more frequently, it frightens those that are involved in corrupt activities. And as such, one of the questions that I constantly get asked is, will the government, will investigators ever find out about this bribery and corruption? And will anybody else report it to them? And that really depends upon whistleblowers, because if a whistleblower comes forward, it's much more likely that the government will become aware of a particular bribery and corruption issue. And I simply can't advise the companies that come and speak to me about this. They will say, what's the prospect of a government becoming aware? And I said, well, fairly slim, unless there's a whistleblower. And the next question is, well, what's the likelihood of a whistleblower? And I say, I have absolutely no idea. And then the next question is, what can we do to stop that? And then what I say to companies inevitably is, have proper procedures in place, investigate yourself properly, and then go and disclose matters to government yourself so that you get the most credit. So having those bits of legislation in place really incentivizes companies to do the right thing when they come to advisors like myself, who advise them what they should be doing. And that really starts from having a network of whistleblowers who are able to come forward and report matters, by having laws in place which enables companies to come in and self-report. And then, as you mentioned in answer to that question, having investigators, prosecutors, and judiciary who are trained in how to enforce matters that do come through to them, and that a fair settlement can result at the end of all of that. In terms of whistleblowers, there's really two main approaches. One, which is in this slide, is the European approach, which is effectively, you don't necessarily incentivize whistleblowers, you give them protection so that they can't lose their job, they can't be victimized, and so on. Let me make it clear, I think that's a nonsense approach. And I think by far and away the best way is the US approach, which is the next slide, if we can move on to that, please. Which is positively to financially incentivize whistleblowers to come forward. And this is done under, if we can move to the next slide, please, the Dodd-Frank legislation that was brought in 2010 following the financial crisis by the Obama legislation, by the Obama executive and legislature in the US. And that effectively incentivized whistleblowers by providing them, if they provided original information which led to a conviction, and that conviction led to over $1 million being recovered by the government, they, the whistleblower, would automatically be entitled to a minimum of 10% of what was recovered and a maximum of 30%. So in some cases, this has led to hundreds of millions of dollars being paid out to whistleblowers. In the UK and Europe, it's seen as being not very tasteful to pay potential criminals, to pay people to sort of come forward and provide information against somebody else. I think that's a nonsense. I totally disagree with it. I think if you're able to incentivize anybody to come forward, no matter if they're a criminal at the heart of a criminal conspiracy, or if there's somebody whose job it was to stop it happening, I think if you incentivize them financially and in any way you can, with protections too, you break the very heart of these corrupt organizations. And I think this is such a monumental piece of legislation that it should be rolled out internationally across the globe. You only need to look at the people who report to the US SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the vast number of non-US countries that report to the SEC are the UK and Australia. And those countries are reporting there to the US because they don't have their own legislation that enables whistleblowers to be paid. So what they do is they go to the US because companies will inevitably have a US position if they are international companies and operating across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and North America as well. So as a result, the vast majority of complainants to the SEC as whistleblowers who are non-US based are from the UK, very much because the UK doesn't have that legislation in place. So I think that's a critical thing that needs and should be brought in with different jurisdictions. But if we can move on to the next slide, which is really, certainly, the next slide is how to assess the effectiveness of compliance programs, and that's something which is a very difficult task to do if you are, as I was when I was working in government. I was the head of the Bribery and Corruption divisions of the UK Serious Fraud Office. And in that position, we had to assess whether a company had committed a crime. They would often come in and self-report. If they came in and self-reported, we would then look at, did they have adequate procedures in place? And have a defense, which is what we have in that orange box at the top. The middle one is, do they have a compliance program? And therefore, are they a company that should be considered potentially for a deferred prosecution agreement, which is a settlement agreement that would enable the company in question to effectively admit guilt without pleading guilty? but enable them to get a much reduced penalty. So the case of Rolls-Royce, they got a £500,000 penalty imposed against them, and the court said it would have been double that had they not admitted their involvement under the deferred prosecution agreement. And then secondly, the Airbus case that I've already mentioned got a €3.5 billion penalty. And again, that was with a 50% reduction. So had they not admitted their involvement, and had there been a criminal prosecution, they would have been facing a penalty in the region of 7 billion. So as such, what this means is that if you have these incentives in place, you have adequate procedures as part of the law that companies need to abide by, you have the ability for a company to come to a settlement and get a significant discount for doing it, you then not necessarily prevent corruption taking place, but you prevent a very lengthy and long drawn out and costly state investigation that may not get to a conviction. You get companies coming and knocking on your door, and whistleblowers coming and knocking on your door. And then the red box there is really the decision as to whether or not the compliance program is actually so bad that the company, don't deserve any credit at all, they don't have adequate procedures in place, and they should be prosecuted. And to do that, you will really look through all of those factors that are listed in green beneath, as to having policies and procedures, oversight, delegation of authority, training, monitoring, enforcement, remediation, and assess those to decide, should there be no penalty, but a deferred prosecution agreement? Should there be some penalty, or should there be a full criminal action taking place? So those are the things that need to be looked at. But in terms of incentivizing compliance, if we can then move on a couple of slides. So just the slide just before that, in terms of incentivizing methods, you can see there that one can have international guidance to incentivize, that also you can implement effective legislation, and you can also, just move back a couple. Yep, one before that. Just stop. And then also mitigation of punishment, and also incentives for individuals to come forward at different stages, and whistleblowing. I think that as a package and going through each of those is a great way of incentivizing compliance and incentivizing prevention. And if we move on to the next slide, this is the one that we spoke about before in terms of the best practice legal alterations that we brought into place. These are what I like to call the Magnificent Seven, which has the active and passive bribery being brought in and made legal, to the last two, 6 and 7, that we discussed before, incentivizing compliance and incentivizing effectively whistleblowers and providing protections. So if we move on to the next slide, the disadvantage, obviously, of having corporate trials, the old-fashioned route of cure, would be you take a company to court after you've investigated, after you've got all of the evidence, after you've prepared it for trial, and you have a trial. But that has major difficulties: the time to investigate, the time to prosecute, the cost of the investigation, the cost of the prosecution, the length of time that it ultimately takes for the trial to take place, and then the risk at the end of it that something happens procedurally for the case to collapse, or something happens when the decision maker decides to acquit the individuals involved. Which is why then, if we move to the next slide, you can compare and contrast that with the advantages of getting a company to come in and self-report, which are many more. There's less time to investigate. there's less time needed to prosecute. There's a lower cost of investigation. There's a shorter time to the conclusion of the case. There's a big discount for the companies, up to a 50% discount to companies, which really incentivizes them to come forward. And obviously, if they avoid a criminal prosecution, and this ends up being an out-of-court settlement, that they are not prosecuted for a period of 3, 4, 5 years if they provide changes to their policies and procedures, if they pay a penalty, etc. That avoiding of a criminal conviction means that the company, is able to operate on an international basis. They are not debarred from applying for public procurement contracts and the like. And again, there's an upside to the company if they effectively admit their guilt and get over it. So they're making an admission, and then they're telling the public that they are remediating issues and moving forwards. And then shareholders will often take the view of, well, actually, that's good. The company is not going to be involved in a protracted legal dispute. They're accepting what they've done. They're providing assistance to the government, and they're going to get a penalty in a short period of time. And as a result, that provides a lot of security to shareholders. And ultimately, an example of that given at the bottom there is that in the Rolls-Royce case, in the day that it was announced that they were paying £500 million for 30 years worth of corrupt payments across 5 continents, instead of their share price just plummeting because of that bad news hitting the market, actually, the market, when it heard that and heard that the company had admitted, was assisting the prosecution, got exceptional discounts, and was moving forward and was able to operate going forward, their share price increased by 4%. So again, this is a win-win scenario. The case took 4 years to investigate. I was involved with it before I left the SFO and joined private practice. So I was there at the very start. It lasted 4 years, which is very rapid. SFO cases, which can last as long as 10 years. Secondly, they were able to reach a settlement and move on. And then thirdly, they have moved on and upwards in terms of they are now much stronger than they were 4 or 5 years ago when they admitted this matter and self-reported to the authorities. So what are deferred prosecution agreements? We've touched upon them a little bit, and if we can move on to the next slide. Essentially, this is a process within the UK that I was involved with bringing out a settlement process that would effectively incentivize companies to come in, but wouldn't lead to them getting a criminal conviction. And what it essentially is an agreement to avoid criminal prosecution and have an early settlement with self-investigation by companies and reporting to the authorities. And that in exchange for that early reporting to the authorities and provision of information, what the prosecutor does is agrees to refrain, to not bring a criminal prosecution pending the company effectively carrying out the terms and conditions of the agreement, which will be admit involvement in bribery and corruption via statement of facts, which must be signed as being true, accurate, etc., etc. Next, pay a large financial penalty, which will be discounted from what you would have got if you had a criminal trial, by imposing compliance requirements on a company to change their policies and procedures, to get rid of members of staff, whatever that may be, and then some form of restitution and compensation to other governments, to paying back prosecution costs and the like. So ultimately, what it means is that a company can move on quickly and that the government gets a free investigation. The company investigates, the government checks it, and then once the government is happy with it, it gets the company to pay the fine and also to pay the government's costs for the investigation. So it effectively ends up being much quicker, much cheaper, and in fact cash generating. Over the course of the 10 years when this has been brought in to law in the UK, I think the UK has made something like 1.8 billion sterling out of this. So it's a significant plus side for the Serious Fraud Office in the UK that they've been able to use this legislation and bring in a significant amount of money into the UK Treasury. In terms of the process, just moving on briefly to the next slide, you will see there that essentially there's the evidential test. Is there sufficient evidence of potential bribery and corruption that would enable an investigation and potential conviction to result. The next one is the public interest. Would it be in the public interest not to actually have a criminal conviction, but to have a deferred prosecution agreement? The next stage is really the deferred prosecution agreement negotiations between the prosecution and the company. The next one is agreeing the terms and conditions and the facts of the supposed bribery and corruption. And then it's the court procedure, going to the court, getting the court to approve it, and then going public with the result at that stage. So that's really the process. And part of that going public with it is that there is a private hearing with the judge so that this discussion about a potential settlement doesn't hit the market, because it's done in private with the court. And then once the court agrees it and gives that judicial independent seal of approval, then the whole proceedings can become public, and then the market will be told about what happens. And if it doesn't get agreed by the court, then the company can then go on and fight the case, have a trial, and then there won't be any publicity about it having potentially admitted guilt or being concerned about guilt at an earlier stage, because those discussions are private. But looking at a number of recent cases, if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that there are a number of cases here which really exemplify the whole position and sort of pull together why I think this deferred prosecution agreement, combined with the Section 7 control liability punishment for corporates for failing to prevent bribery, are really two critical things, along with adequate procedures, whistleblowers, and so on, that really force companies to prevent bribery taking place, and then force them to come forward and assist the authorities at a much reduced cost for the authorities. And Airbus, we've already mentioned, which is effectively a UK, US, and French investigation into the use of external consultants, agents, to bribe customers effectively to buy Airbus planes in Asia and Africa. And Airbus was fined in relation to 5 counts of failure to prevent bribery. That's Section 7 offence under the Bribery Act. But instead of actually facing a criminal trial, they settled via this agreement, the deferred prosecution agreement. Your prosecution will be deferred for a number of years if you pay a financial penalty, and the financial penalty you will see is 3.6 billion. Globally, the UK element of that was just short of 1 billion euros. And that was a 50% discount. So a big discount was given to the company for coming forward. And again, this investigation lasted approximately 4 years. So again, a very quick investigation that resulted in the company assisting and providing information, and trials of individuals are potentially going to be taking place afterwards using the information that the company brought forward. But now the UK government, the French government, and the American government have shared 3.6 billion between them as a result of the penalty paid, and then also prosecution's costs were paid to the different organizations so that their cost of investigating was effectively cancelled out by the company. So again, a cost neutral position for the government investigators in question. Rolls-Royce, the second case that is listed there, UK, US, and Brazilian investigation into 30 years of alleged wrongdoing in Rolls-Royce's aviation and energy businesses in Asia and Africa, with the use of intermediaries and corrupt payments, and 12 counts in total under the old legislation in the UK, and then also the failure to prevent bribery. And then a DPA worth £500 million, including on top of that, the SFO's costs of investigation was agreed. And as I've mentioned before, in this particular case, the court said that they were considering nothing other than a criminal prosecution as being the fair thing to do. But the one thing that persuaded the court was the exceptional cooperation of Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce provided something like 30 million documents. They improved their compliance program by investing something like 15 million into that compliance program. and they provided a lot of legally privileged documents. They just handed everything over to the SFO and absolutely helped the SFO's investigation. And the court said that because of those exceptional elements of cooperation, the fact that the SFO hadn't reported, the Rolls-Royce hadn't reported the matter early to the SFO, you know, it was over a period of 30 years and they didn't report it. In spite of that, the exceptional cooperation handing over all of this material to the SFO entitled them not only to a DPA, deferred prosecution agreement, but also to a significantly reduced penalty. And those types of cases have been followed in two more recent cases, the airline services case, which is a much smaller company coming forward and effectively self-reporting. And then again, Amec Foster Wheeler, again, another international company, and that was in July of this year, came forward in relation to their use of corrupt agents and agreed to pay a settlement of about $200 million, which included the US, the UK, and the Brazilian authorities in relation to bribery and corruption from 1996 to 2014. So as a result, this has been, the deferred prosecution agreements are being used by the US, by the UK, by a number of other authorities across the globe, including the Brazilian authorities. They have the Clean Companies Act, the French authorities who have Sapin 2, and we have also Australia, Singapore, and other jurisdictions have brought in deferred prosecution agreements. So again, I think this is something which is an incredibly helpful tool for countries to have in place, and then something which really does incentivize that early reporting and so on. If we can just move on briefly to the next slide, I'm coming up to the end of the hour, so you'll be glad to hear that I'll be...
Estamos a 2 minutos,
okay.
3 minutos para llegar a las 11.
No problem. Well, I was just... Perfect. Well, all I was going to say is the next slide really highlights what the penalty ranges are within the UK. I'm not going to go into that in any real detail. Safe to say that here you can see the big penalty range from, if you have a lower seriousness of harm point, and if you come in and cooperate super early, you can get discounts of something like 75% off your ultimate punishment, to at the very end of the scale, if you're at the top end of seriousness, top end of harm, and top end of coming in very late and not cooperating at all, you're looking at potentially 400% increase on the penalty that you could have. So that's a huge sentencing range, from 75% reduction to 400% multiplier on top of, and therefore we're getting a much bigger penalty. And if we just flip on to the next slide, just pulling all of the things that we've discussed together, you know, you do need to have those fundamentals in place. You do need to have money. You do need to have education publicly. You do need to have training with investigators and the like. And then moving the slide on to the next one, you do need to have these legal changes brought in, the Magnificent Seven, which I've mentioned before, of active and passive bribery, public and private sector bribery, the significant penalties, the compensation, the incentivizing whistleblowers and the incentivizing companies. Having that package of measures together then means that organizations and individuals worry about getting caught, and there's a race for them to come in and hand in for information across to you, government officials, to investigate and take cases forward. It's worked very well in the UK. It can work very well in Peru. And if there's anything obviously which we can assist with, or GovRisk or others involved in organizing this conference, we're happy to take those forward at a future stage. But Alonso, am I within the 2 minutes that you were looking for?
Thank you, Patrick. A continuación, muy interesante realmente. Yo mismo tengo preguntas. I have some questions later for you. Vamos a continuar con los comentarios de Susana Silva. Ella es licenciada en Derecho por la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú y magíster en Derecho aplicado al desarrollo por la Universidad de Warwick en Inglaterra. Es secretaria de Integridad Pública de la Presidencia del Consejo de Ministros, cumpliendo la función de secretaria técnica de la Comisión de Alto Nivel Anticorrupción. Un gusto, Susana, muchas gracias.
Gracias. Muy buenos días con todos. con todas. Es un enorme gusto estar aquí, más aún cuando se trata de un espacio de diálogo, de evaluación, de reflexión sobre cómo se están haciendo las cosas, no solamente en nuestro país, sino en el mundo, específicamente en este caso en Inglaterra, a propósito de la conmemoración del Día Internacional de Lucha contra la Corrupción. Y sobre eso yo quería empezar un poco a reflexionar. Hoy día, bueno, el 9 de diciembre se conmemora el Día Internacional contra la Corrupción, y si bien esto viene dándose desde el año 2003, hay convenciones, como bien ha señalado Patrick al inicio de su exposición, hay convenciones, hay marcos normativos internacionales. Sin embargo, pareciera que los países en general y específicamente aquellos que estamos en la región latinoamericana y nuestro país en particular también, pareciera no salir de esta historia de corrupción que por tan largo tiempo lamentablemente nos acompaña. Y es que han habido muchas idas y muchas vueltas, han habido muchos avances y retrocesos también. Y una de estas herramientas como avance efectivo en la lucha contra la corrupción es el compliance. Si bien el compliance o los programas de cumplimiento, los programas de integridad que pueden aplicarse, ojo, no solamente en el sector privado, sino también en el sector público, nacen con una lógica específicamente orientada a prevenir, y es de alguna manera lo que da pie a la denominación o al nombre que se le ha puesto a esta presentación que ha hecho Patrick, sobre que es preferible prevenir antes que curar. Sin embargo, el compliance en sí mismo es también no solamente una herramienta para prevenir, sino para garantizar que haya una respuesta adecuada frente a un problema que ocurre. Hay muchas cosas que ha señalado Patrick que me parecen sumamente importantes y voy a referirme a algunas de ellas. Una que se ha señalado durante la presentación es la relación que existe entre el sector público y el sector privado. Cuando nosotros hablamos de corrupción en general, vamos a encontrar corrupción dentro del sector público, dentro del sector privado, pero sin duda en la interrelación, en la interacción entre el público con el privado, es en donde se presentan los mayores riesgos de corrupción. Si nosotros solamente miramos, no solamente en Perú, sino a nivel internacional, cuáles son los mayores escándalos de corrupción que se han dado en los últimos tiempos, vamos a ver claramente que están referidos básicamente a tres ámbitos, que son los tres ámbitos que refiere la OCDE en su documento denominado Recomendaciones sobre Integridad Pública, y que son las contrataciones, segundo, las contrataciones, compras públicas, segundo, los procesos de inversión pública, y tercero es la penetración de dineros en la toma de decisiones dentro del Estado, que se da básicamente a partir del financiamiento a distintos partidos políticos, con la finalidad obviamente de obtener un beneficio a futuro. Si nosotros evaluamos estas tres figuras, estos principales riesgos que la OCDE señala que existen en toda sociedad, mejor dicho, vamos a ver que el denominador común en ellos es la justamente interrelación del público con el privado. Entonces, en esa línea, algo que a todas las sociedades, y aquí en Latinoamérica en particular, nos debe obligar la experiencia ya aprendida en otros países, es que debemos poner los mayores reflectores en todas las dimensiones en que interactúan el público con el privado. Compras públicas, sea a mayor, mediana o pequeña escala, inversión pública, financiamientos, pero no solamente estas modalidades de relacionamiento, sino también todas aquellas que son colaterales a estas modalidades de compras, de inversión pública y de financiamiento de partidos políticos. ¿Y a qué me estoy refiriendo con estas manifestaciones colaterales a estos principales riesgos? Son aquellas situaciones que están manifestadas como, por ejemplo, los conflictos de interés, con entrega de regalos, con gestiones de interés o lobbies que se producen alrededor de estos tres grandes procesos. ¿Por qué? Porque estas manifestaciones colaterales son justamente las manifestaciones que nos van a permitir alertar de la existencia de cualquier situación irregular que pudiera estarse dando a nivel de un proceso en que interactúan público con privado. Lo segundo que quiero referirme a lo que ha señalado también Patrick, es que él en algún momento hablaba de los estándares de integridad que en efecto tienen que implementarse de manera adecuada para efectos de que pueda funcionar de manera efectiva un compliance. Sin embargo, ahí nos enfrentamos, por lo menos en Perú y en Latinoamérica, a un primer escollo. Y es que nuestros estándares de integridad son están señalados, están definidos en un nivel excesivamente general que no permite entender claramente a los operadores, a las personas, a los funcionarios, a los empresarios también, cuál es el alcance real que tienen estos estándares de integridad. Si se habla, por ejemplo, de que está prohibido el conflicto de interés, ¿pero qué significa un conflicto de interés? ¿En qué momento un conflicto de interés está en el marco de lo que está contemplado o está prohibido en las normas? Y cuando, por ejemplo, un conflicto de interés, si bien no está contemplado dentro de las prohibiciones en el ámbito de las contrataciones, por ejemplo, pero sí está contemplado desde prohibida desde una perspectiva ética. ¿Qué hacer? ¿Qué no hacer? Y es ahí en donde hay todavía algunos vacíos que no se terminan de entender y que pasan en algunos casos muchas situaciones por agua tibia y no terminan siendo sancionados adecuadamente. Y junto con ello, el hecho de que nosotros en Perú, para el sector público, tengamos un código de ética de la función pública que aún con sus limitaciones y deficiencias, desde la perspectiva de que es muy general, orienta a los servidores públicos, pero no existe un documento o una orientación o un código de ética que sea aplicable, por ejemplo, para todo el sector empresarial y que les permita entender cuáles son las buenas prácticas corporativas, sobre todo en la relación que tiene que haber con el sector público. Entonces, ahí sí creo que hay un pendiente de parte de nuestro país. No puede dejarse a discreción de cada empresa limitar o definir, mejor dicho, cuáles son esos estándares de integridad, porque para una empresa multinacional, sobre la base de las exigencias que puedan ser requeridas desde la FCPA, por ejemplo, puedan tener estándares de integridad que están a un nivel 10, pero pueden haber otras empresas nacionales que tienen estándares de integridad que solamente están definidos en un nivel 3, 2, 4. Entonces, es necesario, desde mi perspectiva, caminar hacia tener por lo menos lineamientos generales en lo que debería ser la ética empresarial en el trabajo, en el desarrollo del compliance y en el desarrollo de la interacción que tienen con el sector público. Pero de la mano con esto hay un elemento que es indispensable. Patrick, cuando nos presentó de alguna manera los componentes de lo que vendría a ser un compliance, él de manera acertada nos ha presentado en el primer círculo, digamos, en el que está más arriba de ese esquema, de ese pentágono o hexágono, me parece que nos planteó con unos círculos. Él señalaba que uno de los más importantes era el compromiso de la alta dirección. el pleno compromiso de los directivos. Y es cierto, si es que no existe este compromiso, cualquier mecanismo de compliance que implementemos en el sector privado, así como también en el sector público, no va a tener un impacto real, no va a tener un contenido que realmente se traduzca en un adecuado o en una adecuada performance de parte de la entidad. Y claro, nosotros podemos ver desde la perspectiva, desde la casuística de muchísimos casos de corrupción que se han dado a nivel mundial, que muchos de los grandes casos, uno de ellos, el caso Odebrecht, tenía un compliance, tenía un esquema de compliance, y no solamente tenía un esquema de compliance, un programa de compliance, sino que además fue premiado por tener ese compliance porque tenía debidamente estructurado todo. Y claro, podemos tener adecuadamente estructurado un compliance, pero en realidad el contenido, el valor real que tiene el compliance parte de la voluntad, del compromiso, del involucramiento de la alta dirección, porque si no simplemente vamos a estar hablando de un compliance que es solamente un cascarón, que tiende a ser una pantalla para decir yo cumplo simplemente, pero al final del día no hay un contenido real. Y
Estimada Susana,
sí,
ah,
perdona,
creo que hemos llegado al tiempo. No sé si quieres
perdón.
cerrar tu presentación con algo más, porque vamos a continuar luego de una encuesta. Te hacemos una encuesta y continuamos con una ronda de comentarios.
Sí, no,
¿Te
no es una
parece? ¿Te parece?
presentación, es solamente comentarios y algunos aportes adicionales. Yo creo que me quedo aquí en el tema de la ejemplaridad que quería mencionar respecto de lo que es la voluntad política de la alta dirección, que no es solamente la voluntad política, el compromiso real de una empresa, sino en general de una sociedad. Si nosotros queremos caminar a tener adecuados estándares, adecuado cumplimiento, en realidad, este compromiso de la alta dirección tiene que ser un compromiso de los principales actores en un determinado país que sirva como ejemplo efectivo de cuál es el camino en el que se debe continuar. Gracias y felicitaciones a Patrick por su presentación.
Gracias. Y entonces hacemos una pequeña pausa para la pregunta. Tenemos una pregunta más, una encuesta más. Entonces le pedimos a todos, ¿nos va a aparecer? En su opinión, ¿qué aspecto priorizaría para mejorar el relacionamiento del sector público con el sector privado? Escoja la más relevante para usted. Asegurar que ambos sectores cumplan con la misma exigencia, estándares de integridad. Implementar en el sector público mecanismos de precaución frente a delitos de corrupción en su relacionamiento con actores externos. Asegurar transparencia de los vínculos e intereses de los funcionarios con capacidad de decisión en el sector público. Y cuarto, poner en práctica mecanismos eficaces que aseguren la identificación y gestión de los actos de gestión de intereses lobby. Les pedimos entonces que vamos a darle un minuto o algo, un par de minutos para que respondan. Ya por el chat nos cuentan que ya están respondiendo, así que les agradecemos. Y luego vamos a tener unos 10 minutos más de debate y cierre. Vamos a dar unos segundos más. Y quizá ya nos pueda mostrar las respuestas. Excelente, gracias. La respuesta más votada es la primera. Asegurar que ambos sectores cumplan con la misma exigencia, con los mismos estándares de integridad. Eso parece que esa es la respuesta más popular, pero no la única. Y la menos votada, pero también importante, es poner en práctica mecanismos eficaces que aseguren la identificación y gestión de actos de gestión de intereses. Muchas gracias y pasamos a los últimos minutos para comentar esta encuesta y, bueno, comentar la participación del señor Patrick Rapo eso. Entonces, no sé, para empezar de repente, Susana, ¿tú tienes alguna pregunta que hacerle a Patrick? ¿O Patrick quiere comentar la encuesta? Si no, yo tengo una pregunta, pero les dejo a ustedes primero.
I was just going to simply say that the poll responses are incredibly interesting, and I think one has to maintain the same high standards across the public sector and the private sector. But again, ultimately, I think all of the any of those answers are good answers. But what I've certainly advocated in the past, other Latin American jurisdictions that GovRisk and myself have been involved with. We're always very much in favor of that, setting up the adequate procedures, principles, trying to get that guidance out to companies and to government officials, frankly, on what they should be doing to do the right thing. Again, in terms of answer to Susanna, that's certainly something which we regularly advise on and assist with. So we can pull together and work on, and other countries are doing the same thing, working on how to make that better and how to make compliance better for companies. So it's been happening in the US for a number of years, in the UK with the Bribery Act. And again, it's something which we're always delighted to assist with if it's of assistance. But that's just my general overview. So any other questions that you have, Alonso, or from anybody else in the audience, please feel free to ask us. I did see that there's one question, sort of one in relation to what is a bribe in the UK. And it's effectively where an individual or a company offers, promises, or gives a financial or other advantage, and they intend in doing so to induce somebody to perform improperly. So it's basically an offer, it's an inducement to perform improperly, and it's some kind of advantage, a reward. So it's very simple, very clear, and very broad. But that's the basic sort of UK position. And I think built upon that is the compliance procedures as to how you get out of being guilty, which is Susanna's point as to how you can incentivize companies to come forward to do the right thing, government officials to do the right thing, and so on. And then there's the punishment side of things, which I think is very significant in the UK and the US. But anyway, that's one of the questions I noted, so I will stop. Alonso, is there anything else that came through to you that I should answer?
Well, I was very interested by... voy a hablar en español, disculpen para que traduzcan y no confundir las cosas. Los incentivos que cuentas se ofrecen en Estados Unidos a partir del 2010. Los incentivos económicos, yo no estaba al tanto de eso y me llama la atención porque la impresión que tenía por mi experiencia, bueno, por cosas que he oído sobre el whistleblowing, esto que es denunciar la corrupción dentro de la propia organización, la impresión que tenía era que a los whistleblowers o a estas personas a los que denuncian corrupción les va mal, terminan mal. Es decir, es lo ético, pero te ganas problemas, ¿no? Bueno, la empresa te va a atacar, vas a tener que asumir un juicio, el juicio va a costar, especialmente, no, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos, ¿cuánto cuesta? Bueno, en el Reino Unido también, ¿no? La defensa legal es carísima, en el Perú también, pero tienes que defenderte legalmente y luego es difícil además reubicarte laboralmente, esa es la impresión que yo tenía. Esto ha cambiado con esta ley del 2010 en Estados Unidos y en Europa. ¿Cómo les va a los whistleblowers? ¿Les va bien? ¿Les va mal?
Really, there's two things. The
Sorry,
European.
just to interrupt, Patrick. I think that some people have said that they couldn't hear the question. If you could just repeat the question in your answer, so it comes through on the Spanish as well.
Okay. The question is ultimately, is the position in relation to whistleblowers one that they are actively coming forward, or are they not coming forward and assisting because they get damaged by the process, and has the financial incentives of the 2010 American legislation changed that in any way? So in answer to the question, no, that incentive program doesn't give protections to whistleblowers of itself, but most of the European legislation does provide protections. So the UK position and European position is to provide protections. And in fact, there's a whistleblower directive which is coming out on, which has got to be enforced by the 17th of December. And if you need that, and somebody else asked for the slides in this case, we can, sort of GovRisk and the organizations that are involved with this session will be able to send you out the slides. But and also the links to the European Whistleblowing Directive, which is due to come into force on the 17th of December, that protects whistleblowers, and that's the UK law protections. The US position is on top of those protections. They try and incentivize by bringing forward whistleblowers. The whistleblowers will not generally be actual criminals themselves, because that will be more of a supergrass, somebody who is a criminal who's basically coming forward to say, I have information, please don't punish me, please don't prosecute me. And that's a separate immunity system that would be in place. And that's the type of thing that happened in mafia type cases, where you'd get a supergrass coming in who would provide information against the top mafia figures, and in exchange they'd get a new identity, they'd get monies, they'd get moved countries, and so on. So that's a separate position. The position in relation to whistleblowers is more for witnesses who've been involved. That's the classic position for whistleblowing, and it is a very active process. There are a lot of whistleblowers coming forward. It is used a lot, and because they are also protected in the US, they get protections and they get this financial incentive, so they have lots of individuals coming forward. Every couple of months, there's a huge US case in the financial services sector, because that's where this applies. It's only for financial services cases. But in those cases, there's a huge amount of whistleblowers coming forward, and they get paid significant amounts of money. So the system works well. You can, if you have a job to audit, a job to do compliance, you can still provide whistleblowing information and still get paid. Likewise, I think you can still get paid if you're an active participant but in the crime, but those are much less likely cases, and it's much more likely that those individuals who've actively participated would be applying to give evidence against their co-conspirators. So they would probably not be applying for whistleblower protection. They'd probably apply for immunity from criminal prosecution because of providing information against their co-conspirators. So I hope that answers your question, Alonso.
Sí, muchas gracias, Patrick. Yo tengo más preguntas, pero no sé si alguien tiene otra para no acaparar la atención. Mi pregunta entonces.
Oh, we're always happy to any additional questions we can also clear up sort of afterwards. So if you if somebody can compile them together, I'm sure Governors can compile them and I can speak and send out some answers to people. Otherwise, get in contact with me on LinkedIn and or Governors on LinkedIn and other social media platforms that we may or may not be associated with.
Casos como Volkswagen o Teranos, porque yo te he escuchado hablar de sobornos a autoridades públicas, ¿cierto? Esto es algo diferente a lo que ocurre con Teranos o Volkswagen. ¿Recuerdas el Dieselgate? Que son grandes escándalos corporativos, pero que no necesariamente me parece involucran sobornos a autoridades, ¿cierto?
Yeah, the question related to whether or not Dieselgate type cases with Volkswagen and other manufacturers that tried to suppress the data in relation to how much diesel and fumes were being emitted from vehicles, therefore able to charge a higher price for those vehicles. Query whether or not those are bribery and corruption cases. No, they're not. Generally, they're treated as providing false information, so they're more fraud type cases. But ultimately, I think the principles are the same, because this anti-corruption legislation of failing to prevent somebody lying in the Dieselgate type cases, or failure to prevent a bribe in the classic Bribery Act formulation, is an offence which is being brought into the UK a lot. So there is an offence of failure to prevent tax evasion. And that's been built upon the failure to prevent bribery offence. And I think the next stage is the stage that you're talking about, Alonso, which is how do you prevent those Dieselgate type cases? Well, you bring in a failure to prevent legislation clause for financial crime. And this would be a financial crime in Dieselgate, because anybody who put a defeat device on a car testing system that would under-register the amount of diesel fumes that were being emitted is clearly defrauding the market, is clearly defrauding purchasers of that car because they're buying it on false information. So if you've got a failure to prevent offence, then the Volkswagens, the Mercedeses, the other manufacturers would be liable because they had failed to prevent their employees from lying to the market. So there could be a fraud offence under normal fraud laws, and you could bring in a failure to prevent type offence. But if you bring in those adequate procedure measures, those 6 principles which Susanna was referring to in terms of those circles going around from failure, from corporate tone at the top right through to monitoring and so on, you can bring those in for failure to prevent financial crime. And I think that incentivizes good corporate behaviors, not just for bribery and corruption, not just for tax evasion, as has been brought in the UK, but also for financial crime generally. And I think that makes companies much better social players within society, because they have a duty to look after their staff's health and safety. They've got a duty to make sure their staff aren't committing bribes and corrupt activities, and they should also have a duty upon them to stop their employees defrauding others and lying. And I think these failure to prevent type offences and these adequate procedures could be rolled out in a number of different scenarios, not just bribes.
Muchas gracias. Hemos llegado al final de la presentación. Definitivamente, Patrick, nos has dado información muy útil, cosas que tenemos, bueno, que sin duda podríamos aplicar en el Perú, donde, bueno, tenemos serios problemas de corrupción, como decía Susana, tanto en lo público y en lo privado. Así que te agradezco mucho, te agradecemos mucho, y ojalá sigamos en contacto contigo. También agradecer a Dominique Lemoignan, director de Government Projects, por su apoyo, a Eloy, a Susana por su participación, a María Fe Torres por la excelente traducción. A todos, gracias, y no sé si hay algo más que decir.
Delighted to assist
Si
from our
no-
side, and feel free to get in contact for anything future.
Yes, and just to say, as Patrick mentioned, we'll send out to the electronic version of the slides to everyone that has registered to attend as well shortly.
Gracias a todos los participantes por sus preguntas, por estar acá y hasta la próxima. Nos vemos entonces, gracias.
Bye-bye.